So thank you very much. Thank you all for making it to this session. My name is Sergey Radchenko. I'm the Wilson Schmidt Professor at the School of Advanced International Studies. We have a very distinguished audience here, but before I get to introductions, which will inevitably be very short because we have lots of people and lots of material to get through, I just wanted to quickly mention what this event is about. This event is part of the annual three-part series of Johns Hopkins SAIS Global Risk Conference, intended for a non-technical audience. This conference aims to engage policy and professional communities with scholarship emerging from the school's Master of Arts in Global Risk. These three panels that happen throughout the year are each dedicated to a specific area of global risk at the forefront of the public policy debate, politics, economics, and energy. The heightened instability of countries, regions, and financial markets in the world today demands a new way of looking at global challenges. It also requires a new kind of global leader, one who's able to predict, understand, and analyze risk in a rapidly changing and interconnected world. To meet the growing demands of both the marketplace and candidates seeking to advance their understanding of the global risk and uncertainty, Johns Hopkins SAIS offers a specialized Master of Arts in Global Risk, a 13-month cohort-based program at the SAIS Europe campus in Bologna here. The Johns Hopkins SAIS Global Risk Conference has been made possible with the generous support of Mr. James Anderson, a SAIS Europe alumnus and chair of its advisory council, as well as a Johns Hopkins University trustee. So thank you all for coming here. We're just emerging after 4 hours of intense discussions on energy, on security, on Russia. But what this panel is about is something else. This panel is about the future of Russia's relations with Europe. Hence, it is called Russia and the West. All bridges burned. I say burned with a question mark, although, depending on how we'll look at it, you may just replace the question mark with a period or even a punctuation mark. All bridges burn forever. Joining me for this panel today is we're very pleased to have Dmitri Alperovitch up there on the screen. Thank you, Dmitri, for joining us. Couldn't be here in person, but very much with us in spirit and has been very actively participating also in the workshop. And then I'll quickly just introduce the speakers. We have right here Alexandra Gabuev, an old friend of mine, also a leading expert in Russia-China relations. We have Kadri Liik from the European Council of Foreign Relations, who covers Russia there, has been doing great work. Nigel Gould-Davies, right next to Kadri, has a distinguished career in diplomacy, dealing with Russia, in Belarus, among other things, and is now at the IISS. Then we have Alexandra Prokopenko, who is who's representing herself here as an independent analyst, but has a distinguished career in banking, including a stint at the Russian Central Bank, where she held a position until 2022. And finally, last but not least, we have a leading energy expert with us, Sergey Vakulenko, who is 25 years of experience in the energy sector. So welcome once again. We only have an hour and a half to discuss where Russia is going. Also, Dmitri, who's up there, has to leave a little bit early. So I propose to start with you, Dmitri, and perhaps ask you this. Okay, a few months ago, you and I wrote an article together in Foreign Affairs, and it was a difficult article to write. As you remember, we went through multiple drafts, and it was called, what was it called now? It was called something like Our Long Game with Russia.
Another Russia is possible.
Huh?
Another Russia is possible.
Another Russia. Well, that's the title they came up with, but we had our own title, right? We had our own title. So that is a big question that we're still trying to work it out, because we are focused now on, of course, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, the war that continues even today, where up against the 1-year anniversary. But do we have a long-term strategy? How do we imagine Russia and the West looking ahead going forward? Dmitri, would you be willing to share some remarks on this?
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you for having me. SAIS Bologna. Sorry I couldn't be there today in person. So I think the one thing that we should appreciate right off the bat is that this is indeed a long-term strategy. I think most people now appreciate that this war is likely to last quite some time, potentially years. Could last as long as Vladimir Putin is in charge of Russia. And clearly, while this war is going on, any sort of rapprochement with Russia is out of the question. So the precondition to a change in relations in Russia is an end to the war that is on acceptable terms to the Ukrainians and the West. Having said that, I think we should be realistic about what Russia could look like in the future post this conflict that may not necessarily be aligned with our wishes. And in fact, is probably not going to be aligned with our wishes. We certainly wish for Russia to be an open, free, democratic society that respects the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, human rights, and so forth. We certainly hope that liberal opposition figures, many of them who have left the country or are now sitting in Russian jails, could take power in Russia and push it into a different direction. But hope is not a strategy. And the likelihood of such an outcome, I think, is low, and we need to appreciate that. And frankly, when we look around the world at our relations with other countries whose regimes we may dislike and whose policies we may oppose vehemently, perhaps with the one exception of Iran, and I'm talking about the US specifically here, appreciating that Europe has quite a bit of a different relationship with Iran than we do in the United States, but perhaps with the exception of Iran, we take countries as they are, not as we wish them to be. And even though we have incredible disagreements with the Chinese Communist Party, we deplore what they're doing to the Uyghurs and the suppression of freedom of speech and democratic governance in Hong Kong and so forth, we still find ways to collaborate, increasingly less so for other reasons, but nevertheless, we are trying to keep a civil relationship and a productive relationship with China. Similarly, with other nation states whose regimes we vehemently oppose. And what we talked about, Sergey, in that Foreign Affairs article is that we do not necessarily need a free and democratic Russia to have a turn in relations with that country. And in fact, if such a country does not emerge, we thought about what are the conditions for changing the relationship with Russia, and what could we get that is realistic in the mid to long term with Russia that would be in both countries' interests. And what we came up with is that we are unlikely to turn Russia into a friend. Even frankly, if it turns democratic, some of Russia's core strategic interests are not aligned with Western strategic interests. And Russia still desires to be a great power, a power that has influence around the world. And even if you have a democratic leader, let's say Mr. Navalny would somehow become president of Russia, some of those sentiments that are deeply rooted in Russian society would not disappear just because authoritarian leader and Mr. Putin is now gone from the Kremlin. So we should be realistic that this is not about turning Russia into a friend. This is also not about turning Russia into some sort of ally against China and bringing them into our camp, because Russia has no desires to be in anyone's camp. Again, with the historical view, perhaps unjustified in this modern day and age, given Russia's diminishing power, but nevertheless, with a historical view of them as one of the world's great powers, they don't want to be in anyone's alliances. They want to be creating alliances and running them. So it's not necessarily about that and doing some sort of reverse Kissinger, reverse Nixon approach and turning Russia against China like we turned China against the Soviet Union back in the 1970s. But what it is about is appreciating that the dynamics that we now see in the China-Russia relationship, and Sasha Gabuev has written really fantastic pieces in the Foreign Affairs as well on this issue, are now such that China is increasingly turning Russia into a vassal state. Not necessarily an outcome that Russia wants, but one that it has no choice in because of its policies, including its illegal and genocidal war in Ukraine, disconnecting it from the West and increasingly disconnecting it from the Western economic system, which is driving it into the only option that it now has, which is the embrace, not so warm embrace of China. And given that China tends to treat other powers with great arrogance and never misses an opportunity to take advantage of the relationship and the power dynamics, unequal power dynamics that exist in those relationships. And we're already seeing that in the China-Russia relationship as well, where right now China is taking advantage of Russia in terms of the fact that it's losing customers rapidly for its gas and to some extent its oil to get a much better price, a price that Russia may not necessarily want to pay. That's not a market price for its fossil fuels. Those types of things are only going to accelerate Russia's resentment of China over the medium to long term. And that, I think, presents an opportunity to not turn Russia into a friend, but to turn it into a non-aligned power where it is equidistant from the West and China and is balancing that relationship in some of the ways that India has been balancing the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, and now even to some extent the West and Russia. And that ultimately is in the best interests of the United States and the West, and in the best interests of Russia, where we do not have another power, even with diminished capabilities, in China's corner in this renewed era of great power competition, where there's no question that China presents the fundamental challenge of the decade and really perhaps a century for the United States and the West. And at the same time, where Russia would have other options to diversify its economic relationships and become less dependent on China. And that could have a moderating impact on Russia's foreign policy, where in exchange for giving Russia a lifeline in the future, we could moderate its imperialistic ambitions and perhaps even find accommodation to this conflict in Ukraine over time. Again, I want to emphasize that the hostilities have to end, the atrocities have to end, obviously, and Putin likely has to go before any of this becomes realistic. But that is the future that I think is both possible and perhaps even the most likely scenario that's the most positive for the West and for Russia, and one that we could live with.
Well, thank you, Dmitri, for giving us a glimmer of hope on that front. Certainly is something that we have been thinking about, and it's certainly interesting and fascinating to look ahead and speculate what Russia might emerge from this. With this, I would like to continue our opening remarks here, and we've got lots of people to go through before we get to open discussion. So we will. Shall we go over to you, Sasha? Okay.
Because I will just pick it up because I very much liked Dmitri's and Sergey's article, and I encourage everybody to read it. My question after I have read it is this. How do we put that into practice? So imagine Sergey Sobyanin becomes like mayor of Moscow, becomes the next president, And he believes that this war is just stupid, it's a Putin mistake, he can blame the war on Putin. But then the reality he will inherit in a couple of years will be this. There might be a standstill in Ukraine. There is ironclad conditions for Ukrainian victory defined by President Zelensky, and there is nothing so far to suggest that the Ukrainian society will move from this. 1991 borders, reparations, and accountability, so punishing all of the war criminals and people who gave this terrible order to invade Ukraine, and then guarantees that this will not happen again. So it's okay, and it's probably the easiest part is reparations, because there are assets of the Russian Federation frozen in Western central banks, so there are multiple ways how to accommodate this. 1991 borders tricky. Do we know that what the Russian population will accept this when it comes to Crimea and other parts? We don't know. We don't have sociological data. 10 years from now, even 5 years from now, all of the top brass of Russian army, police, secret services will be veterans of the so-called special military operation. A lot of these people will be committing war crimes in Ukraine, or by Ukrainian definitions will be believed to committing this war crime. So can we imagine that the next Russian leader will stand up to the backbone of his regime and say, all of you guys have tickets to Hague and you go to the court and then do your sentence there? It's very hard for me to imagine. And then 5 years from now, the Russian population, which is already pretty much accepting the war, will be even more brainwashed and like would believe the government narrative that we've been attacked and like it's Russian people that have been slaughtered in Donbass and that we had no other choice have to stand up and defend us and that we were battling NATO. So in practical terms, it's very hard for me to imagine the accommodation because to me, Ukraine will be very much stubborn in its lines. And then in the West, the economic rationale for bringing back Russia whatsoever will be gone. Europe will definitely adapt. And I think that in many European countries, there will be no desire to go back as business as usual, like no dependency on Russian oil, gas whatsoever. And then we will be in the middle of the next phase of the energy transition. NATO will learn how to deter Russia. And then the policy will be much more, I think, pluralistic in a way that a well-organized minority can really put a lot of limitations of what Kissinger-like statesmen are able to do. So there will be a lot of Ukrainians who have American passports, women who've been in Bucha or Irpin, who will find Senator Ocasio-Cortez or others and say like, hey, here is the picture of my family which were murdered by the occupying Russian forces. Do you really want to go back to business as usual with these people? And my very final point, on the other part of the equation will be China, where Russia will be having 70% or 80% of its trade. And China will say, oh, President Sobyanin, your granddaughter writes really nice Chinese characters like in Tsinghua. And she is classmate of our party secretary of Guangdong province. And by the way, we paid you 100 RMB for a bottle of oil. How about 110? Like, we like you a lot. And these are the chips that Putin was interested in. We probably can give you to them. So the Chinese leverage over Russia and the ability to give cookies and carrots to Russia, I think, will be much more than the Western ability to give this carrots and cookies. So the reality you, Dmitri, and Sergey described is very attractive to me, frankly. But I see a lot of problems in putting that into implementation. But the very final point, the situation ahead of us is as clear as mud. So we really don't know what will happen the next 6 months. So we'll see.
So thank you very much, Sasha. And Dmitri wanted the right of first response to this. So I'll go back to him for a second.
So really quick, and Sasha, you raised great points. This is by no means going to be easy. And we're going to have to look for opportunities that present themselves. And our ability to shape this may be quite challenging. But the one point I really quickly wanted to make is that regardless of what happens with the war, we cannot ignore Russia over the long term. It is still a country of 140 million people, the largest landmass on Earth. Even though Europe will be much less dependent on Russian fossil fuels, it's still a country with incredible natural resources and critical minerals, and foundational minerals like aluminum and nickel and others that are absolutely vital for the global economy. And obviously, it's also a country with the largest, one of the largest arsenals of nuclear weapons. So our ability to completely pretend that they don't exist and ignore them over long term is not sustainable. So we are going to have to figure this out and have some sort of relationship over time. Thanks.
Thanks, Dmitri. That's yeah, very important point. Sasha, I know your view that you think that Russia will turn into some kind of a big version of Iran or even North Korea. But I wanted to turn over to Kadri, who hails originally from Estonia, and I wonder if Russia did turn into Iran or North Korea, how would Estonia feel living next to Iran and North Korea? How does that work for Estonia? Or maybe generally for the Baltics, would you be able to address this?
Yeah, well, I think the notion in the Baltics is that they are already living next to Iran and North Korea on steroids. I don't think that, you know, for them that comparison would necessarily mean a turn for the worse. For the Baltics, the Russia question is, of course, complicated. You know, these days, the Baltic states very often say that, you know, we have always warned the West about Russia. We always knew what Russia was like. You never listened to us. Now you see that we have been right. Now listen to us. And I've been thinking about it. What is it actually that the Baltic states could have known, or that we did know? I mean, I'm part of that debate in the Baltics, so I know the experiences and arguments. And of course, I don't think that the Baltic states had any sort of very acute, fresh analysis about Russia's war designs in Ukraine. I mean, yeah, they got that knowledge from the US. I mean, there was some intelligence sharing in NATO, and that's why they knew. I don't think that their own sort of Russia expertise ever extended to the level of knowing that, yes, Putin is planning for war and this is happening for reasons X, Y, and Z. However, there were some insights that the Baltic states have better than others, simply by the virtue of their own experience. And I'm not even talking about the experience of occupation, but rather experience in the early 90s, when the Baltic states started building up a full sort of state-to-state relationship with Russia from scratch. And no one else did that. I mean, even the sort of former Comecon countries, they had their own old relationships which needed to be adapted to the new eras, but by and large, these were still sort of interstate relationships, whereas the Baltic relationship went from intrastate to interstate. So that was a leap. And in the course of that, they could see that now Russia envisioned it differently from the Baltics. The whole question of legality, what's happened in our relationship, what should be done about it. Moscow suggested that the Baltic states are the ones who have separated, so Moscow as a former motherland can impose some conditions under which they are free to go. The Baltic states would say, we have been free ever since 1918, when we declared independence. You have meanwhile created some mess here. Now please clean it up as soon as possible. And that was not necessarily the idea that went down well with Russia. The whole question of legality of occupation. I mean, Russia still maintains that occupation in 1940 was legal. The Baltic states have never subscribed to that view. And also the attitude that small states cannot potentially have independent agenda. I mean, Putin has said that on the record. You used to be vassal states of Germany, then Germany handed you to the Soviet Union, then we handed you back. You know, Baltic states are a parcel handed back and forth between Russia and Germany. and that is of course not how the Baltics view themselves. So I think they have some first-hand experience about Russia's tendency to view small neighbors as pawns in international politics, countries with no proper agenda of their own, maybe sort of created by mistake with arbitrary borders. I mean, you name it. And I think that could have given Baltic states some insights into Russian thinking also about Ukraine. But of course, that's not enough to handle the situation now. I think the whole idea that we need to have some kind of relationship with Russia, even with undemocratic Russia, even with Russia, we don't like, that doesn't come very easily to the Baltic states. It has never come. I mean, the Baltic states, I think the policy prescription in the Baltic states is that we need to democratize Russia or boycott Russia until it democratizes. I think it is flawed. I don't think that the Baltic states are in the position to democratize Russia. I don't think that boycott can lead Russia to democratize either. Or, if ever that could have been the case, that was long ago. So, and I think there is a need to accept that Russia has interests that diverge from ours. And that comes very hard for both sides. I remember also in Moscow, I have worked in Moscow as a journalist, and I interviewed many Russian policymakers in late 90s, early this century. And many of the so-called liberals or Democrats would tell me that, we were such good allies in struggle against communism, and then you just left and left us to deal with that mess. So they had a sense of betrayal. And the Baltic states then said that, listen, but you failed to democratize. You are not delivering here. And both are sort of guided by the idea that we should have similar goals. I don't think we have matured to understanding that, even nice Russia might not have identical goals with ours. And now actually that dilemma is freshly out there in the context of how we treat Russians in exile, because many of them have come to the Baltic states and they are not finding it easy. I think the closure or TV channel Dost that set itself up in Latvia and then moved to Amsterdam after its license in Latvia was stripped. I think that's a prime example where Latvian expectations totally diverged from how the TV channel saw its mission. The TV channel was talking to Russians in Russia. That's why, they refer to Russian troops as our troops, which they should do, being a Russian TV channel, even if they condemn the war. That went down very badly in the Baltic states. Russian troops are enemy troops. For Russian TV channel, it is impossible to say so. And then they made a mistake with a map. They broadcast a map of Ukraine where Crimea was part of Russia, and that of course caused an outrage. Maybe rightly so, but on the other hand, yet again, as a former journalist, things happen in journalism all the time. I discussed with my own former colleagues. One admitted to having published a map of Baltic states where Latvia was replaced by sea. It just happened. And it does happen. You have fast production cycle. And if you are sort of national newspaper, then you get ridiculed, but it passes. I mean, that's just an incident. If you are a Russian media in the Baltic states, that is taken as evidence that you are working for the Kremlin. So in a sense, I'm happy that TV Dost was forced to emigrate. I think they will have more peaceful life in Holland that is not so sensitive about everything Russian, because it really would have been hard for them in the Baltic states. So I think there is really work to be done, understanding that Russia might be fine, even if they don't have agenda like ours. And that work, of course, for the Baltics now will start after the war. And also, I think the Baltic states will again discover that them having been right about Russia or thinking they have been right does not necessarily translate directly into their ability to shape European policies. I mean, they seem to be doing so now, and up to a point they do. They are really good in stuff, articulating their positions, their maximalist messages go down well. But that's because there is a great deal of unanimity in Europe, and I don't think that Putin really gives them any openings for approaches different from what we have now. I mean, there is no real prospect of negotiations. Relationship is about supplying arms to Ukraine. If when times change and things become more complicated again, I think the Baltic states should make a leap to being more creative in how they propose policies, how they cultivate allies, build coalitions inside the West, and how they think of sort of European policy that works for all of Europe, not just the maximalist taste of Baltic states and Poland.
Thank you, Kadri, for this insightful remarks, and also for opening the can of worms about Russians and the Baltics, etc., which we all have been following this drama, and so on. We can return to this in the questions. I would like next to turn to Nigel, who has probably more experience than the rest of us here in terms of his very lengthy diplomatic career, going back many years. Also, you just recently published an op-ed in the New York Times, I believe it was, about Russia's red lines, or lack thereof, and that's an interesting thing. But that deals with the current situation, i.e., how far we can push Russia, etc. What should we be afraid of or not? But Nigel, what about the blue sky vision here? I mean, we've been talking about it. What is there? Okay, so let's say Russia loses the war. Is there something on the other side? What's your take?
Thank you. Before we go to blue skies, which require a degree of heroic creativity at this point, I would say, I just want to say a little bit more about the black skies that currently face this situation. And to draw attention to how many bridges have been burned, to use the title of this event this evening. As I see it, there is really an unprecedented degree of mutual estrangement between Russia and the West. Far worse than even the darkest moments of the Cold War, actually, with possibly the exceptions of the very early 1950s when the Korean War was at its height. And in particular, we can talk about the Russian side of this and the anathematization, demonization, quite literally actually, of the West on official TV and propaganda channels, the language of the satanic West and so on. Let me say just slightly more about where the West is at this point, just to, again, emphasize how difficult the situation is. As I see it, the West is far more unified and resolved, and has continued to be throughout this war so far, even as it's escalated its positions against Russia, than, again, any time during the Cold War. Even the darkest moments of the Cold War, there were differences and difficulties, divisions within Western states and between them as well. And yes, there's been plenty of wobbles and wars of words on occasion among Western allies about this country or that not being sufficiently resolute and strong in its position. But the big picture is that every Western state except Hungary fundamentally supports the same position and the same outcome in this war. All Western societies as well, it's not just civil societies, it's societies as such, even the parts of the West that don't particularly take an interest in foreign affairs. There's a deep instinctive and reflexive and visceral support for Ukraine. You see it all over the place in flags and stickers and just manifold visible signs of this. There is not anywhere in the West, again, except Hungary, a significant political party or movement that is yet saying we have to see things from a different point of view. We have to recognize the costs to ourselves or the risks of the position we're taking on Ukraine. We have to see things from Putin's point of view. No one is saying that. And most remarkably of all, the private sector, large numbers of companies have voluntarily amplified sanctions rather than simply complied with them. That's never happened before. So you've got this strong idea. Why is that? What explains this? Put this in comparative perspective very briefly. I would see essentially the Cold War as, in the main, driven by a sense of a security threat. Yes, there was a moral and ideological sort of casing to it that amplified that, the language of the free world versus the authoritarian or totalitarian world. First and foremost, it was driven by security concerns, I would argue. Much more to say about that, especially with a Cold War historian to my right. But I offer that thought at this stage. In the post-Cold War world, it was all about humanitarian interventions, which were moral urgency and agony without the interests, without the sense of security threat in Somalia or the former Yugoslavia or elsewhere. And here for the first time, you've got the two fused together, an urgent security threat to Europe and a sense of moral urgency and outrage as well, driving emphatically in the same direction, each reinforcing the other. And that powerful glue, I think, is likely to remain. And that means it's very difficult to, at this point, to see past that. And one of the more perhaps disquieting consequences of this is that we're getting new kinds of arguments in the West about Russia, which we never saw during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the position generally was our quarrel is with the government and not with its people. And we've got elements, more than elements of rhetoric now, which are moving towards sort of an anathematization and condemnation of everything Russian, including Russians as well. So again, draw the contrast in the past when people fled or escaped from the Soviet Union. They became exiles. They were sort of looked after in the West and sympathized with by the West. We have a very different situation now. It debates the merits of that, but there is this, one might describe it even as an essentialist critique of Russia. So if that sort of seeps in and settles into the consciousness of particularly the younger generation of Europeans and sort of fixes and hardens, how easy or difficult will it be to get beyond that and think about a different relationship with Russia? One consequence of this already is that it's quite clear that an end of the war would be much more than a matter of whether lines are drawn on maps. There's a whole series of other issues that have to be resolved, and I think the colleagues have already touched on these: war crimes, reparations, the fates of the over 1 million now Ukrainians, including several thousand children, be forced into Russia. What's going to happen to them? What about the future of sanctions as well? There's going to be a sort of complex set of legacies here that the West will insist on resolving to its satisfaction before anything like a semblance of a future relationship could be established. And as colleagues have said, I think absolutely correctly, if this regime or anything like it remains in power, then I think all bets are off in respect of anything that could be, after the war, be considered a relationship properly so called, anything more than simply keeping Russia at bay. Even a President Sobyanin, if it came to that. Sobyanin is one of those who's made a trip to the front or close to the front. Who's not implicated in this war one way or another? It's very difficult to see a future dispensation of power within Russia that the West could consider is conceivably trustworthy. You might say, okay, we have to deal with the Russia that we will have and not the Russia that we would like. That makes good sense in its own terms. But then the question becomes, what could Russia possibly offer that would make us wish to cooperate with it? what would be the basis of mutual cooperation? And to push that question a little further and a little more provocatively, one might be minded to ask the question, is Russia still a great power? Whatever that means exactly, great power to a Western ear feels a bit kind of musty in 18th or 19th century, still used without irony or historical distance in Russia. But if we mean something like a great power is a power that can exert, achieve desirable effects well beyond its borders, well, what does or what will Russia have there? We've already seen its weaknesses laid bare across multiple domains of power. It's not only the obvious one of military capacity in the field. It's cyber as a dog that hasn't barked. Russia's drastically diminished capacity, much feared before the war, now much diminished, to salt the information space of Western societies with its own malign narratives. Who really believes in any numbers the Russian view of this war in the West, at least? Russia's economic power, we've had some good discussions earlier today, I'd argue is diminished and it will face growing difficulties. Yes, it's geographically the largest country in the world. Raises the question, how important is size in this respect? Yes, it has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. That's a way in which it's a threat, of course, one that would have to be contained. Could it serve as the basis of cooperation? So I've pushed just to sum up some of these thoughts, I appreciate the story in a pessimistic direction. But so there's two factors then. Firstly, the legacies of this war in terms of long-term perceptions of Russia and how hard it will be to restore any degree of trust. There's a great deal of trust in the early 90s and for some years after. Whenever it will be, the late 2020s, 2030s, people will be thinking back to that period and saying, look, we had hopes then, and look what happened to them. It's not safe for us to have hopes again. So that lack of trust, but also, again, what in terms of power and use and value in the world does Russia offer that could serve as the basis of a constructive agenda of a relationship? Those are pushing a bleak direction. I'll be happy to be proved wrong, but those are some of my thoughts at this point.
Thank you, Nigel. It's usually the Russians who are, the pessimists, the fatalistic pessimists. But we have heard a very dark vision from you. Although, as a historian, I have to say that we're only 1 year on into this terrible war. If you look at kind of long run of European history, we have had 30 years wars, and even 100-year war. So I think we may well be in that sort of game. It would be very sad if this were the case. So just to continue our blitz introductory remarks, and next I would like to turn to Sasha, who she earlier, and she's an expert in the financial industry and obviously has a wealth of experience with the Russian Central Bank, from what we've learned a great deal from you today. But I wanted to ask you something else, and that is because we are focusing on kind of big themes. You are one of those who effectively, is now exiled from Russia. You've left, you've sought refuge as the war broke out. What's your take on what we have just heard here from Nigel about, this widening gap and bridges being burned and so on and so forth?
Hi everyone, and thanks, Sergey. I actually didn't understand clearly from Nigel's take. So, do we need to write off Russia from the map after this? Actually, and maybe unfortunately, or for the luck, it's impossible because Russia is too big and very complicated, and it's also need to keep in mind that Russia is a part of Europe, and mostly Russians are Europeans, and Of course, Russia started this bloody and disastrous war, but Russia also suffer from this in terms of people and in terms of economy. And of course, well, there is a big discussion in economy about sanctions. So do sanctions work or not? In my personal opinion, they do. But the worst thing with Russian economy was made not with sanctions, but with starting this terrible war. And it wasn't the West who started this. So basically, what I've learned from here that when I moved from Russia, it was a big step. Not only for me, I'm privileged. I was privileged to make this step because I know different languages. I have a profession, and I am demanded specialist, not within Russia, but outside also. And lots of my friends were less lucky. And lots of young people who now flee from Russia. So there were two waves of exodus from Russia. One Russia experienced in March at the beginning on the fears. Just shortly, the war started on the fears that all young men would be drafted and sent to the war. They didn't want to. And people went to multiple directions they can get. And well, basically what we see from economics that countries like Georgia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan get an injection of young people who are smart enough, who are good in different entrepreneurship stuff. And well, these economies are growing unexpectedly fast during last year, and we can say that this growth is sustainable, and Russian firms, well, being disagree with Putin's policy and with starting this war, Russian firms frachted airplanes to withdraw their stuff from Russia in spring. The second, but lots of people wasn't so lucky or so successful in their immigration. So and they returned. Also because they trusted to the government that this is not a war but special military operation. That's what propaganda in Russia says to people, that in spring it was like the only professionals do this, not ordinary people do this. It's not your business. That's what Russian leadership told to their people. So some people come back and they were forced to leave Russia next time in autumn after the mobilization was announced. So basically, for lots and from this wave, I know no one who returned to Russia because they were betrayed by their government more than twice during 1 year, and that's a very short period. And all these people now well, they're worldwide, and they experience lots of problems with visas. They experience lots of problems with their incomes, and they actually face an existential crisis. So, speaking about that's not a good experience. Of course, I would rather not to compare their experience with the experience of Ukrainians, but I do believe that all these Russians who flew away from country and who they are also victims of this war, and there need to be a plan for them how to integrate to a new society, to the countries where they are living now, or maybe when and after this war will end on terms of, well, we'll hope that it will that it will come sooner than later, that some sort of integration plan to all these people back to normal life and back to society, because it's the most productive and most effective part of Russian society. And one of the biggest problem which Russia will face right now, or which Russia facing right now, is the brain drain and lack of not so-called, like economists like to say, labor force, but it's a lack of smart and intelligent people. And there are shortages on financial sector, on management side, and even military industrial complex, which now is flooded by money in Russia, faced a huge demand in talented people. And well, basically because most part of talented people just flew away because they were not agreed to taking part in this war. Yeah, so what I think, and there is the West developed the Marshall's Plan for Ukraine, and it's good. And I think that part of Russian reserves need to be spent on this. But what I also think that there should be some, not maybe Marshall Plan, but integration plan for Russia after this war ends, because we cannot simply write off Russia from the map, and we cannot simply say that Russia is not exist anymore and think that Russia is pariah state, unfortunately. Thanks, I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. I already see that we have very, very different different perspectives developing. Last but not least, I wanted to turn to Sergey, not me, the other Sergey. We have on this panel two Sergeys and two Sashas, which I think is the fault of Soviet central planning, right? So you have
Sasha can make a wish because she sits between the two Sergey, and everybody here can make a wish because he sits between the two Sashas.
So I turn now to Sergey with this question. So you are one of the world's leading experts on Russia and energy. We talked earlier about that book by Thane Gustafsson, the bridge it's called, where he argues that basically gas, energy, etc., connected Russia and Europe. But now, is this bridge also burned? Or can it be rebuilt? Do we need to have it rebuilt?
It's a good question, and there are two different schools of thoughts on this. One is that energy supply is so crucial, so important, that even minor disruptions in it wreak havoc in everyday lives, in industry, for people, that it's quite imprudent to rely on a country that once has shown to be a major unreliable partner, and quite a few times have shown that from its own machinations or from gouging other countries, it was unreliable as well. So Europe, despite the cost of that, would try to find alternative sources of energy. Another school of thought is that Europe might not rely on Russia as wholeheartedly as it did until recently, but still such a substantial source of quite affordable energy just next door creates a natural pull and push that at least some energy would come to Europe. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of discussion that energy transition to alternative fuels, to renewable energy, would mean the end of this cooperation without the war. However, in European plans for decarbonization, it was always stated that Europe is not going to be self-sufficient in energy, that Europe would still need to import energy, whether by power lines from Africa Solar or something like that, or in the form of hydrogen that would be either produced with carbon capture and storage from methane, or from alternative energy sources, that Europe would still need to import energy. And until 2022, there are still discussions that one of the major sources of energy exports to Europe in the decarbonized world could be Russia, with its vast amounts of gas that could be converted to hydrogen with carbon captured and stored in depleted gas fields, with large resources of wind energy along the Arctic coast, which could be delivered to Europe through DC current line, or it could be hydrogen produced from that electric current. Politics changes, but the physical realities do not. Europe still will need energy imports. They will have to come from somewhere. I find it quite impossible that Europe would stake larger hopes on Russia and keep Russia as a prime energy source. But Russia might still be a part of after war peaceful settlement energy balance. And again, this trade relationship has been restored many times after very fierce conflicts, very fierce fighting. Making a step back, by cutting gas supplies to Europe, Russia has not only sacrificed its current flow of energy, current flow of revenues, but is also sacrificing a flow of revenue for future after war government and country for an interesting reason. Let's assume there is peace. Let's assume Putin goes away. Let's assume Navalny becomes a president, agrees to peace terms, and there are at least attempts to improve relationship with Europe. But by that time, Europe would have been signing long-term gas supplies with alternative sources like Qatar for LNG and others. So naturally, without any political considerations, there will be less space in European markets for the new supplies of Russian gas, for example. And that's an interesting corollary, but something that has to be kept in mind.
Okay, thank you. That's very insightful. We've got about 30 minutes for questions, so let me just throw this wide open. Now, I wanted to mention that we have an audience online as well, I think about 60 people. So please, those of you online, submit your questions online. Those of you here, please raise your hand, identify yourself, and we'll take it from here. Okay, Federico. Yeah, do we have, we'll need a microphone so that people online can hear.
It's a question for Professor Gould-Davies. It's about the history, because I think every situation is special and different from every other situation. But we can think about Germany after World War I, and then Germany after World War II, and Italy after World War II. Of course, the approaches were very, very different. Which one, if those are the two models, let's imagine those are the two models, which one would you recommend for Russia after this ends?
It's very interesting.
That's interesting. It's an interesting way, interesting comparative frame to put this issue, because they're talking about major wars in Europe, so of which this is the latest. So I think the first thing to say is that in both cases, it led to a change of regime in the country that had started the war. And that was an essential precondition for a different and more productive relationship to follow. In the first case, it was a change of regime without an occupation that led to a temporary improvement in relations before they then became far worse as a consequence of an adverse change in regime in the 1930s. In the second case, after 1945, it was a regime change that followed an occupation, actually 4 occupations, in effect, by 4 countries, and led to peace and prosperity and integration into the West, at least in the part of West Germany, until the end of the Cold War. The Cold War itself was a further end to a war, not one that was led to large-scale violence on the European continent, but it also, again, required a change of, in effect, a change of regime and a disintegration of the country itself in 1991 to lead to a fundamentally different relationship. So of course, we're all playing with these grand historic analogies and wondering which of them could, conceivably bear relevance to the future of Russia's relationship with the West. Clearly, any kind of occupation of Russia is unthinkable and undesirable. No one begins to have an interest in that. No one is thinking in those terms whatsoever. The essential demand is the return of Russia to its, the Western demand, the return of Russia to its 1991 borders. No one wants to go further than that. So we come back to this point about a change of regime for domestic, as a consequence of domestic factors within Russia itself. Could that follow the end of the war? And that seems to me the only possibility for a relationship that could be new and better. It would require a quite fundamental change in the dispensation of power in Russia. Even then, as I say, given the disappointments of the 90s and so on, it would be very hard, and the legacies of what has been happening in Ukraine, hard to get over the collapse of trust that has set in now, the kind of the moral anger that has followed. Now, we should never say forever and never say never. So one day, yes, the relationship will be better, and we should be prepared for surprises. But just to finish on this, yes, the only two ways that the relationship between Russia and the West can change fundamentally are, firstly, if Russia wins the war, which Putin still thinks he can do, I believe. And if that were to happen, then Russia would gain the upper hand and be able to define the relationship with the West on terms much more of its choosing. The second way that the relationship could change and get past the current collapse would be if there's quite fundamental change in Russia. That's a matter not for any outsider, that's a matter for developments and forces within Russia itself.
Thank you for that. Let me bring in one question from the online audience. We have here Linda Brook, who's asking, on the issue of Russian people after the war, what can we learn from post-Second World War German society? It's post-West German, presumably, not East German, right? Who wants to have a go at that? Maybe I should have a go at this because I'm the historian. I mean, the question of Germany is fascinating, of course, and Nigel, we're on the same page in many ways. But I have to say that in 1945, post-1945 American, in particular, investment in West Germany was in many ways the consequence of the Soviet threat. And that much is clear. The existence of Marshall, the proclamation of announcement of Marshall Plan in June 1947 was a direct result of what the Americans thought was happening in Europe, the Soviets extending their influence, undermining potentially American security interests in Europe, and not because suddenly everybody had this idea, oh, the German people have changed or something like that, right? That is clearly security. But I wonder whether the same might apply, and maybe that's a question for Sasha, might apply to Russia if China suddenly develops as a major threat, and it will be in Western interest, particularly American interest, to invest in Russia, because otherwise it would become a vassal of China, or it has become a vassal of China, or to ply it away from China.
Germany was defeated. The capital was captured, it was partitioned. It took a symbolic trial of the top tier of Nazi leadership. And then a lot of people went to Argentina and other parts of the country. The judges who sent trains full of Jews to Auschwitz were still sitting by late 60s when the next generation, with all of the RAF terror and stuff, started to ask questions after decades of prosperity and integration, like, okay, why so many functionaries of the Western German Republic are former Nazis or are people who were very much integrated in the regime? And that's where, like, Karl Jasper's essay was written in, I think, 45 or 46. And then this wave of kind of working on history and real recognition of what has been done and attempts to improve relationship, payback for the past mistakes and integration of these elements into the educational system were really very much the product of the kind of decades of prosperity and security and happened in against the Cold War context. So it's just very hard for me to conceive, and here I totally agree with Nigel, that unless there is a fundamental change within Russia, that people said, it's not that we lost the war because the West shared intelligence, but because it's the most immoral war, arguably, that Russia has ever led. Unnecessary, but also immoral. And we need to pay the reparations. We need to have this war crime, not to accommodate the West, not because we've been defeated, but because we need it as a nation for self-correction. That's not necessarily the attitude that will be very much shared, although the Russians claim to be Christian, and that's very much the backbone of the Christianity concept of this, of sins. It's very hard to see that happening. And then again, on the other side, there will be China that to me will have much more opportunities to provide incentives for the Russians to stay as they are.
I just wanted to offer floor to Dmitri, who has to go now, but he wanted to say a couple of words.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Nigel's comments and kind of try to inject a little bit of reality here, I think. The reality here is that this war is going to continue until both sides decide to stop fighting, right? At the end of the day, both sides can continue this for a very long time. And while we want everything, right? Total victory where Russia withdraws from every bit of Ukrainian territory, there's war crime trials and reparations. But let me just give you one scenario where Russia, perhaps a new Russian leader, makes an offer to Ukraine to say, we're going to pull back from all of the territories, including Crimea. Let's just use that as a hypothetical. And that's it. We're not offering anything else. No war crime trials, no reparations, nothing else. You know, I find it hard to believe that any government in Kyiv would say, no, we're going to keep fighting and dying to have some trials in The Hague. And we're not going to take this territory offer that's going to be given to us, right? So I just think that we need to be realistic that, you know, however this war ends, and hopefully it ends with Ukraine getting all of its territory back, they may not be able to get everything that they want in terms of Russia conceding on every single point. And the total defeat of Russia, I think, in terms of how Germany was defeated, to Sasha's point, is highly unlikely, which is why I think the fundamental changes to Russian society we should not be hanging our hat on that.
Just to respond to that, you're right, of course. If Russia were to make that offer, then the war would end. And I cannot see any circumstances in which Ukraine or anyone else would want to continue fighting for objectives beyond that. The question, however, then is, the war having ended, what does the future post-war relationship between Russia and the West look like? And I think that even if the war were to end on those most favorable possible terms, as far as Ukraine and the West are concerned, that would not lead in any sense to a normalization of the relationship between Russia and the West, which is ultimately the issue I think we're discussing this evening.
And then keeping the sanctions will be an essential question here, because even with the sanctions removal, it's not necessarily that all the businesses will come back, as just Sergey has illustrated on the very vital and important example of energy. And then a lot of all of the recent sanctions have been introduced through executive orders. So in theory, the administration can take them back. But what if the Congress and the legislators jump in and enshrine that as parts of public legislation, like happened with CATSA after Trump-Putin meeting in Helsinki, and then put conditions like and it's very easy for parliamentarians to do just that for multiple reasons. That will complicate everything, and it will not lead to the ultimate resolution, even if the cessation of hostilities is achieved.
Right. Well, let's continue our discussion. We've got a few more minutes, and thank you, Dmitri. So Dmitri has to run off, so see you later. Yeah, let's continue. Yeah, I'll take some questions from the floor, please. Students in the room, okay? Don't be shy. Yes. Say who you are and.
Oh, you guys hear me? Yes. Hi, I'm Josefina. Thank you guys so much for doing this. So you guys have talked a lot about how if the war stops and if Navalny becomes president, but I would like to know, in your expert opinion, if you guys had a crystal ball and you could see how realistically, not best case scenario or worst case scenario, realistically, how the war will end, like what will happen to Ukraine, what will happen to Russia. I would like to know opinions on this.
Any takers, and specifically anybody wants to offer?
Okay, there are multiple scenarios and we can attach some probabilities to this, but my prediction would be that Ukraine won't be able to restore all of the 1991 territories. It will reclaim hopefully a lot, but not all. In a best case scenario, it will be able to deter further Russian aggression by the supply of Western weapons and just be in a very formidable conventional force that will deter the Russians. Then Ukraine will face multiple problems because a lot of people who left Ukraine and have their kids in Polish schools will never return. So there will be a huge migration gap. Some people will return, some will not. Some people will leave the country as soon as the war ends. And that's the sad reality. I don't think that the NATO membership is possible with borders that are not internationally recognized, or there need to be separate provisions which territories. So it will be hard, and it will be outside of institutional transatlantic framework, but probably with a lot of goodwill in a best case scenario. And then Ukraine will need to deliver on good governance reforms. And then the best case scenario for this would be Croatia, where the veterans alliances play an important role in the way the country is run. And like, it's not as pleasant as Western Germany. On the Russian side, my vision is more kind of giant Iran, wealthier, more technologically sophisticated, not as ideological, but something like that increasingly under China's influence going forward. That would be my baseline assessment in broad brush strokes, but
Kadri, maybe would like to your best prediction.
I do not know. I mean, a lot will depend on what happens on the battlefield, and that in turn will depend on arms deliveries to Ukraine. How could they manage to put those? How many mobilizations President Putin is willing to conduct. There is also a strong stress test imposed upon a Russian political system and society. It seems to be relatively resilient for now, but will it last? I don't know. But what Sasha described is of course realistic. I struggle a little bit imagining Russia as a huge Iran.
We've been Soviet Union for 70 plus years. It's just the repetition of this. Why is that absolutely unimaginable? And like the Tsarist regime has been terrible. It's very much back to what the country has been in normal times. The fortunate kind of liberate era of the 90s and the progressive reforms under the Tsar, and then very prosperous and relatively free first decade of Putinism is probably history.
Yeah. But the Soviet Union ended because there were many internal forces that wanted it to end. And, you know, was relatively even, I would say, liberal debate in the final years of Soviet Union, ever since Gorbachev, definitely, if not actually even earlier, in sort of coded language of theater and literature. And somehow, you know, I lived through the Soviet collapse, so that experience in me suggests that we should come around, but maybe it doesn't come soon enough.
Totally possible. But again, people thought about Iran as collapsing soon, and this regime exists for quite some time. Same with Cuba, same with North Korea. And if there is kind of and like the ability of China to be the successful expanding economy it is and bankroll Russia is another question, and that's a very important factor here.
So Sasha, just to chip in, of course, nobody predicted Soviet collapse except for very, very few people. But there's something interesting as well, and this is actually goes back to what Nigel was saying. I would slightly disagree with Nigel here. When we get to 1987, 1988, this seems like, you know, Soviet Union is still around. You know, Estonia is still part of the Soviet Union. I mean, Crimea is still part of the Soviet Union, as far as I can recall. You've got this sudden detente in Soviet relations with the West, so much so that Reagan, who was just really, you know, describing the Soviet Union as an evil empire, etc., comes to Moscow, strolls in the Red Square with Gorbachev, has a press conference. Somebody asks, "Do you still think the Soviet Union is an evil empire?" And he says, "No, this was a different time, a different era." So, you know, we should not underestimate how things change. And to this, there's a question online here by Jack Wasserman, who says, what might the West agree to that might be acceptable to Russia, especially since Russia has legitimate security interests? I used to think Russia has legitimate security interests. Does it still have legitimate security interests? Maybe not.
I don't think that it has real threats that it cannot deter being
With
a nuclear
weapons.
superpower.
That's right.
It didn't have real threats to not be able to address with the military means it has.
I agree. Oh, I agree.
And then the security interests in Europe were code words for dominance over foreign policy choices of Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. That's what it was about.
Shall we bring some more questions from the floor here?
Hiya, thank you. That was a really, really interesting panel. There was discussion of internal forces and also talk of the brain drain and how that negatively impacts Russia. I want to understand, you know, what are the domestic forces at the moment? What is the feeling inside Russia? And does this have the capacity to challenge or question legitimacy of the government?
Can I turn to Sasha on this, please?
The short answer is no, it doesn't. There are lots of people in Russia who are unhappy with this war, and well, of course, we barely can see it from the polls because there couldn't be any legitimate polls during the wartime because people's opinions are biased. But there are lots of people who are unhappy with this. No, they cannot question the legitimacy of the government. They even cannot question the legitimacy of this war because it is illegal in Russia. People are persecuted in Russia. People are going to jail for, I mean, maybe it was yesterday or today, or maybe today morning, Russian court sentenced a Russian journalist from Barnaul. So she will go in prison for 6 years for spreading news about how Russia bombed Mariupol. Maybe you remember this. It was in spring, and there was Dom Kultury, a cultural venue with the big letters kids inside, and it was bombed by Russians. And so now she's going to prison that she spread the so-called fake information about special military operation. And during 2022, more than 20,000 people in Russia or sentenced to different fines, penalties, or even go to jail for questioning this so-called special military operation. So yes, people are unhappy. There are lots of people who are unhappy, but no, it is not safe in Russia to question the authority. And the discourse in Russia turned to, if you are not with Putin, even if you are silent, you're against this war, and people are afraid to be against because it becomes existential to them.
Okay, do we have any further takes from the panel on this? If not, we're coming right to the end of our panel. We literally have 1 minute, so I just wanted to once again thank you all for coming. Thank you for this very thought-provoking and stimulating remarks that we had here today and earlier also in our kind of private session. My brain is toasted at this point, but I have learned a lot. Hopefully once it untoasts, I will process this
and sorry for upsetting you, because throughout this year, my usual disclaimer, and I figured this around late May, whenever I enter a briefing room for an official, I said, like, unfortunately, we are very likely to leave this room much more kind of sad and depressed that we entered. And so far I've been right, which is terrible. I hope that.
Sash, but we've had aperitivo, so we are very happy now.
Yeah, and it's terrific to have this in Bologna, where you have aperitivo, which is curing the professional depression that all of the Russia watchers and Ukraine watchers develop, and that goes without saying. It pales in comparison to what the people affected by this war, Ukrainians, have to go through.
Absolutely, and we just have to remember that we're coming up against 1 year anniversary of this brutal war. I still have not quite recovered. I think all of you are probably traumatized by what has happened in many ways. I'm still, trying to ask myself, what is happening? What is happening to us? But it is wonderful to have an opportunity to process those worries, concerns, thoughts, delusions, hopes, in a company of very intelligent, very informed people, and also our wonderful audience. So thank you all for sticking with us and asking good questions. So thank you very much, and let's leave it at this. Thank you.